Howdy, everybody. So we're picking up with Lyndon B. Johnson and kind of his two big issues during his presidency. Great Society, which was his war on poverty, and how he continually got distracted from that goal with the war in Vietnam. So we last kind of left off. JFK had been assassinated, leaving LBJ as the president. We saw him use the memory of LBJ to get the 1965 Civil and Voting Rights Act passed. And in 1964, after only about a year of being president, he had to run for re-election himself. And so he ran for president with a tidal wave of support behind him. Now, the Republican nominee opposing Johnson was Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona. Now, Goldwater campaigned on small government and local matters, but pouring massive amount of new money into the defense budget for our fight against communism and the Cold War. Now, Johnson campaigned on being JFK's successor, as well as a Cold War warrior again. And you can kind of see on the left his button. It's the ghost of JFK behind him. So he's really running on the memory of JFK's assassination. But that didn't mean Johnson wasn't ruthless in other ways. So this is known as the Daisy ad, which basically, I have the link for the video in Blackboard, and I highly recommend watching that video. It's quite shocking. But basically, he's providing an ultimatum to America. You vote for Johnson, re-elect him, or your kids will die in a nuclear holocaust. So not a subtle move. It only aired once. And so LBJ won in a landslide, taking 61% of the popular vote. An even bigger landslide in the Electoral College, with 486 electoral votes to 52. And on top of this, Congress is controlled by the Democrats as well. So this is going to allow him to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you had the Civil Rights Act of 64, now you're having the Voting Rights Act of 65. Now, what it said is the new law abolished discriminatory practices such as literacy tests and authorized federal examiners to register voters in southern states like Texas. So the federal government basically took it upon themselves to enforce voting rights in these southern states in particular that had been so egregiously violating it. And within a year, they're going to have massive increases in voting. About 500,000 Southern Black voters were signed up. The number of Black voting increased in Alabama by 278%, in Mississippi by 700%. In Texas, the number of Black voters increased from 227 to 400,000 registered voters. But because of this push, because of the Democratic Party going to such lengths to fight for civil rights, they will lose the South for a generation. This is where those two party ideologies finally fully switch, where the Republicans become the conservative party of the South, and the Democrats become the more liberal, civil rights oriented, more focused in the North. And yet, the civil rights movement was not over. We had some progress, but it wasn't done. In fact, things were about to get really violent and move well beyond the South. In 1965, 5 days after Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, the Watts section of LA exploded into violence. It started after a Black motorist was stopped by a white policeman. Now, we'll see that kind of narrative play over time and time again. Before the rioting ended, 34 people were dead, nearly 4,000 were arrested, and property damage had reached $200 million. It took 14,000 National Guardsmen, 7,000 police, and in 6 full days in order to stop the violence, bring order back to the Watts region. And this is bad. The Watts riot marked the first of 4 successive hot summers of racial riots, most of which happened in northern and western cities. This was all coming from Blacks living in these northern cities were deeply angry as they were confined to poor regions, ghettos within the city that were overcrowded, teeming with violence, crime, and poverty. And in 1966, 41.7% of non-whites in urban areas lived below the poverty line. So it's this area that's ripe for anger and resistance. There's going to be into this, that Johnson's going to propose, so in the midst of all this violence, that Johnson's going to propose his Great Society program. Now, this was modeled after the New Deal, and instead of helping us recover from a depression, it was designed to eliminate poverty across the United States. Now, LBJ wanted to do this primarily because he thought it could really help. He didn't think a nation that was so prosperous and so powerful needed to have so much poverty. So he declared war on poverty, beginning America's trend of declaring war on abstract ideas. And some of the main focus of what he's going to do. In 1964, he's going to pass the Economic Opportunity Act. Now, the first big part of this Economic Opportunity Act was the Job Corps. Now, this was training programs geared towards young people, giving them some sort of skill that could transfer and transform their lives in a profitable way, such as trades jobs, helping with the cost of college, and all these types of things, really focusing on trades, plumbers, electricians, all these kinds of things that were necessary and often well-paying jobs. Then you have VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. So this models it on the idea of the Peace Corps. So like JFK's Peace Corps, which reached all across the globe, VISTA is, instead of going to Africa or South America, instead you go to rural places, underprivileged places, inner cities that are suffering, and you try to help within the United States. Now, Johnson also had education programs he wanted to focus on as well. So you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, which authorized $1 billion in federal funding to help benefit impoverished children. Johnson felt that education was the #1 way out of poverty. If you can get these kids education, they can work their way out of poverty. You have the Higher Education Act in 1965 as well, which provided the first federal scholarships for college students and library grants to colleges and universities. Then he also provided free Head Start programs. So if you couldn't afford pre-K, these new Head Start programs were trying to level the playing field with the more wealthy and well-off families. On top of all this, Johnson proposed Medicaid and Medicare. And this is probably going to be the most famous part of the Great Society. When Johnson took office, a majority of older Americans had no form of health insurance. In fact, a full 20% of the nation's poor had never once been to a doctor. And Johnson believed that healthcare for the elderly and the poor was an essential part of the Great Society. So Medicare was a program for the elderly, and Medicaid was a program for the uninsured. So they were united in the same basic concept. The richest country in the world, said Johnson, or in the richest country in the world, people should not go without healthcare simply because they are poor. Now, sometimes this was derided as socialized medicine, but for the most part, this went really well. But it's going to have some unintended consequences. The medical industry lobbied to prevent limits from being set on what could be charged on Medicare and Medicaid. So these limits were never actually put in. So insurance companies, from then until today, are able to charge far more to Medicare, Medicaid, to charge insurance, and driving up the cost of insurance because none of these regulations or restrictions were put into effect. However, the result of all these things is poverty, in fact, did decline in the United States. So in 1960, more than 40 million Americans, roughly 20% of the country, lived below the poverty line. By 1970, that number had dropped down to 24 million, or about 12% of the population. However, despite some success with the Great Society, not everyone agreed with it, and there is going to be some pushback and problems with it. So you have political controversy. So you can imagine the Republicans, which had become the conservative party, were not thrilled with this liberal, high-spending, big socially focused program. On top of that, Johnson was only able to devote limited funding because something kept distracting him. Something kept calling that he couldn't ignore. And that something is Vietnam. So let's kind of recap a little bit about how we get into Vietnam. So we talked about Ho Chi Minh trying to liberate Vietnam from French rule. We talked about how Eisenhower and later Kennedy helped prop up Diem as South Vietnam's kind of American-supported leader, in spite of him not being necessarily the best choice and it's not being purely democratic elections that got him in. On top of everything else, not everyone was thrilled with Diem. We talked about how Buddhist monks protested against this by lighting themselves on fire, and eventually Diem was ousted by his own military. And this is when Kennedy had to send in even more troops. Now, LBJ was not thrilled. He didn't want Vietnam. He didn't want to fight over it, didn't want to do it, but there was something that kind of bugged him, that distracted his focus on the Great Society. He said losing the Great Society was a terrible thought, but not so terrible as the thought of being responsible for America's losing a war to the communists. Nothing could be worse than that. So this fear of being seen as the first president to lose a war drove him to spend untold amounts of money and lives on this war. So LBJ is going to use an event called the Gulf of Tonkin to justify sending more troops into Vietnam to try to ramp up the war effort, to knock North Vietnam out of the war, and to bring it to a rapid end. So after this Gulf of Tonkin incident, where allegedly some weapons were shot at a US naval ship, Johnson rushed a request to Congress to allow, quote, allowed him to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. Now, this was about the closest we ever came to declaring war in Vietnam. So we hadn't really declared it. We were kind of in this policing action. Now, the big question is, did we actually get shot at? And no one really knows, and frankly, Johnson didn't really care. As he told some of his aides at the time, quote, for all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there. This was an excuse for Johnson to kind of knock this war out, get it over with, and move on with his Great Society. Now, the first big point in Johnson's plan is going to be Operation Rolling Thunder, which basically is bomb the living hell out of Vietnam. So between 1965 and 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 1 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam. And it didn't really accomplish a whole lot. The Viet Cong just went underground. The North Vietnamese army was able to keep operating. So nothing really changed. So then the US strategy kind of took this two-pronged form. So continue bombing the living hell out of Vietnam. But if that doesn't work, put a large number of troops down on the ground. And it came back to one simple strategy. Kill a hell of a lot more Vietnamese and knock them out of the war. Then Americans will die and we'll win. It's a numbers game in Johnson's mind. So we had to build up the US Army and our force in Vietnam. And the only way to do that was to establish the draft. And you can see during these years when Johnson takes over, in 1964 to 65, you see a first big spike. And by 68, we reach the height of our commitment of troops in Vietnam. And it's at this point that we see whenever you watch movies or hear about the Vietnam War, it's the Johnson years that we're talking about. Now the draft is set up, and these are going to be fairly young kids, often coming from working class neighborhoods. If you went to college, you were exempt for the draft for a while. Eventually that gets dropped, so you could go to graduate school and maybe get an exempt. But the average age of these draftees was about 19, making it the youngest army in American history. It was an 80% draftee army. This wasn't something popular. People went, did their year of service, and got home. They tried to survive. Approximately 2.8 million Americans served in Vietnam, the vast majority because the draft made them do it. And through all this, the death toll is rising. In 1965, 636 Americans died in Vietnam. A year later, in 1966, 6,664 Americans died. And this is really going to be heartbreaking for the United States. And as a result of this, soldier morale goes down for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, they're not 100% sure why we're fighting in Vietnam. We don't know, and we have this abstract idea of we're stopping communists. But on the ground, the soldiers don't really see it. What they're dealing with is not particularly great. So these soldiers are having to go on counterinsurgency patrols called search and destroy. Basically, you go hunt out Viet Cong, try to kill them, wipe them out. And it's not always clear if you're killing innocent civilians or Viet Cong. It's hard to tell the difference. Then you have jobs like being a tunnel rat, where you had to crawl down with a pistol and a flashlight in Viet Cong tunnels, trying to root it out to see if anybody's in there. You're fighting this faceless enemy in the Viet Cong. You don't know who it is. And often when we tried to help, like give vaccines to some of these villages to try to win hearts and minds, the Viet Cong will follow behind us and chop off the limbs where those people received vaccines. And it's the first time we see the US military making widespread drug use. First it's weed, then marijuana gets cracked down on, so they start switching over to heroin. So this is a very weird time for the US military. Now, most of the US soldiers were not looking to win anything. They were looking to survive their 365 days and get home and be done. And as the death rate kept going up and the draft kept sending wide swaths of young men to Southeast Asia, the domestic resistance for the war began to ramp up. First and foremost, it's the televised nature of the war. The broadcast time for the nightly news expanded by 15 minutes, and these news stations filled that time with Vietnam, the biggest issue of the day. And it wasn't just bad news the combat news that they were talking about. The war was expensive as well. In 1966, the federal deficit was $9.8 billion. By 1967, that had jumped to $23 billion, with the war itself costing about $27 billion. So this is heartbreaking for many Americans. And people began protesting. And there's a lot of reasons for this. People were tired of seeing war on TV. Students were scared about being drafted into the army. People were unclear about what we were actually doing in Vietnam. People didn't like the billions we were spending on it. And perhaps most powerful, a growing group of soldiers who had served and were coming home speaking out against the war. So we start seeing all kinds of protests, but college-age students are the ones that protest the most. So they continue to take the methods of the civil rights movement, these peaceful protests, and begin doing the same on college campuses. Much like the sit-ins, they began occupying college buildings in protest to the war. Even non-radical, hippie kind of people are participating in this. So average guys, you might see someone that looks like a hippie that you would expect being anti-war. You might see someone right next to them in a three-piece suit also protesting the war. Because for all different types of people, the war is beginning to represent something that they don't feel America stands for. But you have this outgrowing from the anti-war movement, which is known as the counterculture. These are the hippies. These are not exactly the same thing as the anti-war protesters. They share a lot of similarities, but they're different in some major areas. Now, coming out of these protests is this new phenomenon, the counterculture. And basically, they're challenging everything that was considered traditional American culture, anything dubbed the establishment. New drugs were everywhere, as was new music. LSD had just become widely available, and rock and roll was entering its own adolescence, being shaped and changed by these new psychedelic drug experiences. And thanks to the invention of pill, it was easy to have sex without getting pregnant. So you have a sexual revolution going into this. You have drugs, rock and roll, and sex all coming together in this new counterculture movement. And the biggest manifestation of that is Woodstock. And I have a documentary linked in Blackboard as well that you can take a look at, kind of a more in-depth look at the 3 days of Woodstock. And this is basically a 3-day orgy of everything at the Woodstock Festival. And despite torrential rains and numerous drug overdoses, most people got out alive, and it was one of the biggest and most culturally significant experiences during the time period. But in the midst of all that is free love, everyone getting along at Woodstock, there's also a new push for a more militant form of civil rights. Vietnam kind of spurring this on, this kind of militarism in the United States. So African-American civil rights is kind of shifting away from Martin Luther King and peaceful protest, more towards Malcolm X, By Any Means Necessary, and the Black Panther Party. So you have angry young Black people trying to push back, rightfully so in some cases, but nonetheless, you have this more militant form of civil rights. Now you see this in the Mexican-American civil rights movement as well. They're going to take the name Chicano power, Chicana. And this is changing things. Its predecessors like LULAC and the GI Forum weren't nearly as radical as this new form would be. So you have a lot of new youth student organizations like Mayo starting to rise. This is the Mexican American Youth Organization. And they're going to stage protests in many South Texas schools. One of the biggest is going to focus around cheerleading, oddly enough. Even though many of these South Texas schools were majority Hispanic, things like their cheerleading squad and some of these sports were white only, which doesn't make sense. And what these students were doing was having march outs and walkouts of the high schools until all the clubs and all the organizations started accurately reflecting the demographics of the school. But they go even further. As these movements begin growing, you get things like La Raza. This is the race. So talking about a united Mexican American or Latin American race to challenge the oppression of white America. Then you have an even more radical variant of this called Aztlán, where they propose taking all the land back that was taken during the Mexican-American War, that third of the US, creating kind of an autonomous region within the United States that would basically live as they traditionally lived prior to annexation to the United States. Now, this was never actually going to happen, but this shows the kind of radical nature that they were talking about. Now you also have the Native American civil rights movement taking off. And this is where we get AIM, the American Indian movement. Now, Johnson will sign the National Council of Indian Opportunity in 1968, but you're going to have a bigger push. So there's the AIM flag. Now, this AIM movement occupied Wounded Knee in 1973 and created a 71-day standoff. Now, Wounded Knee was the site of the last major massacre by the U.S. Army against Native Americans. So this seemed like a fitting spot to kind of protest the poor conditions on many reservations. Now, all of this tended to scare white Americans a lot. And these summer riots that we alluded to with the Watts riot in 1964 to 1968 is going to scare America even more. So the most devastating outbreaks of these riots were in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. 43 people were killed in Detroit, and $50 million in poverty were destroyed. And if all this wasn't bad enough for the nation, it was going to get a lot worse for LBJ. This led into 1968, the year of dissolution, where everything for LBJ and the nation pretty much went bad. Now, the United States media and the military and the government have been saying, we're winning the Vietnam War. A few more months, a few more battles. We've been killing so many Vietnamese. We're going to win. There's only a matter of time. And then, on January 30th, 1968, during the Tet holiday, which normally meant a ceasefire, a massive North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attack happened that attacked a vast majority of US bases. This massive coordinated attack that overran several of our bases. Now, we were able to push them all back, and in the end, we didn't really lose any ground. But the fact that Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong were able to mount such a massive assault on the US when we said, oh, we're winning, victory's right around the corner, proved to many people in America that we weren't, in fact, winning. And when Walter Cronkite goes on the air and says, the best we can hope for is a bloody stalemate, America is shocked because Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted newscasters in the world at this point in time, when he said, the best we can hope for is a stalemate, Americans are like, maybe we should get out of this war. Maybe we should be done. I've also linked his video kind of where he's talking about this and a little commentary on his discussion. And it's going to be in the wake of all this that LBJ effectively resigns. He says, I will not seek nomination for the next election. He says, I'm done. I've done the best I can, and nothing's working. And then it's going to get worse. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated by James Earl Ray on April 4th, 1968, at a hotel he was staying at. And this is going to send the nation into another series of riots. 100 cities will riot, and ultimately about 45 people will be killed across the nation as a result of these riots. And then it gets even worse. Robert Kennedy decides to run for president, and during one of his campaign speeches, an assassin is going to come and kill him as well. And everything seems to be going bad for the nation. And then the final piece falls in. The Democratic National Convention in 1968, where they're trying to choose a nominee for president. It is infiltrated by a lot of protesters, and it is the site of a lot of anger. They try to send the police out to break up the protests, and it turns into more violence, and it looks like everything is falling apart. And the country seemed to be coming apart at the seams, and the Democratic Party appeared to be the party of chaos and discord. Among the general public, there's this growing backlash against the protesters and a renewed call for law and order. But there is one aspect of American culture that does provide some solace, particularly to the confusing times and the confusing experience America might be for children at the time. And this is going to be Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And one of the most interesting things is while this is a children's show, it's going to tackle some very heavy content. It's going to tackle death. It's going to tackle assassination, all these kinds of things. And I've linked a clip of one of the episodes where he's actually talking about assassination on his show, helping kids kind of cope with what they're saying when they hear about Martin Luther King Jr. get assassinated and Robert Kennedy get assassinated and all these kinds of things. So Mr. Rogers is surprisingly going to be kind of this area of peace and solace for many people in America. While it's focused at kids, many adults are going to get peace from this as well. We'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with the rise of Richard Nixon next time.